Hi there, and welcome to The Daily Gardener, a podcast about gardening, botanical history, and literature. I'm your host, Jennifer Ebling, and today is June 21st. Today we celebrate an old account of Tripoli gardens, and we'll remember a botanist, naturalist, and author who believed in the power of walking. We'll hear an excerpt from a book by the author Susan Wiggs, and we grow that garden library today with a wonderful book about small garden design. And then we'll wrap things up with a novelist who found his own garden paradise in the Cotswolds. But first, before we get to all of that, let me fill you in a little bit on what's been going on in my world. The reason that I took a little bit of an unexpected break from the show, and fill you in a little bit on what's been going on in the garden that I'm creating up at the cabin, as well as the garden back here in Maple Grove. Well, first things first, we had a very sad event happen on June 5th. We lost our golden Labrador, Sunny, after having him for 11 years. He really was the greatest dog, and I was not prepared to say goodbye on that particular weekend. He'd been in the garden with me that day on Friday, the day before, and it was super hot, and the heat was a lot for him. And he just declined rapidly after the student gardeners left on that day. And so we said goodbye to Sunny, and it was extremely sad for our family. And then I just decided, rather than powering through, continuing on with the show, I would just take a little bit of a break, not only for myself, but also to comfort the kids, because Sunny was a huge part of the kids' childhood, of their growing up. I don't think we have very many pictures of a holiday or a family event where Sunny isn't in at least one of the pictures. So I did post about it in the Facebook group for the show. So if you're in the Facebook group, you knew what was going on. If you're not in the Facebook group and you thought maybe we were just taking a little summer hiatus, well, we did, but it wasn't one that we wanted to take. It was one that we needed to take. So I just also want to quickly say that I so appreciate all of your support and understanding. So many of you sent a little note. One of you even wrote me a little poem, which I just totally cherish. And I just, what do? These are big milestones, and we definitely needed these past few weeks to get through our grief. And man, is grief exhausting, isn't it? That week after Sunny died, it was so hot in the Midwest. I don't know about where you are, but it was well into the 90s. I think we had a few days approaching 100, and it was like that the entire week. So even if Sunny hadn't have passed away that weekend before, we definitely would have been laying low that entire week following his passing. It was just so miserable out. It was high humidity in addition to the heat. It was just unbearable. Now, that brings me to the second thing that I want to talk about a little bit here before we get into today's show, and that is that I am once again working with my student gardeners. Last year during the pandemic, I took the year off, and my garden definitely paid for that. When you leave a garden alone for a year, it is incredible to see how much of it is reclaimed by nature. And that was definitely the case here in Maple Grove. And so we're slowly tackling this garden, but we have a big mess on our hands here. So we're reclaiming it, we're working on it, but it has been a little bit of 2 steps forward, 1 step back as we try to get through the garden. Now, a couple of the highlights have been that we just installed a brand new fence. And of course, these things never go perfectly smoothly. At least they haven't in my experience. We had a little bit of a lot line dispute with one of our neighbors. And then when the fence was getting installed, I think the guys that were working on it just kind of got sick and tired of the project, and they just wanted to wrap things up quickly. And so at the very end, there were just some sloppy mistakes that were made. And so the fence is not done yet. And so they're going to have to come back and fix that. But we're really happy with this fence. It has completely transformed the backyard. If you have been on the fence about getting a fence, let me just tell you that I can't say enough about this 6-foot tall privacy fence. We had put in vinyl horse fencing 20 years ago that today still looks as good as it did the day we had it installed. And then in the backyard, we had a traditional picket fence that was a cedar fence, and it had completely rotted away over the past 20 years, and it definitely needed to be replaced. But we are loving the transformation in the backyard just with this fence alone. It's definitely elevated the space. It's made it more sophisticated, definitely more private. And now, instead of having that back patio be a space for growing vegetables and herbs, I'm going to be moving my 3 elevated garden beds to another side of the house, and we're going to make that area an outdoor living room. And I'm so excited about that. But it just goes to show that those elevated garden beds are fantastic, because if you ever want to repurpose the space, you can do so quite easily. You just take the soil out, move the bed, put it somewhere else, and voila, instant garden. So one more reason to love those elevated garden beds. Okay, so that catches you up on the fence project. And then I did also want to talk to you about a few highlights of good things that are happening both in the garden here and back at the cabin. First of all, when it comes to the cabin garden, one of the things I did 2 years ago is I installed a lily bed, a garden bed that's devoted just to lilies. And that little area has become one of my absolute favorites. I've got tall lilies in the back, and then the medium size, and then the little size. And they have to get jockeyed around a little bit during the growing season. But I am so thrilled with how this little lily bed has turned out. For one of the episodes that I had done for the Daily Gardener, I had read that lilies in the wild grow on the edges of forests and woods. And so that's what I did when I was siting this bed up at the cabin. I have this area where there are some super tall white pines, and at the very edge of where they stop on the property, in between 2 white pines, I put this lily bed, and it is just the happiest little thing, and I am so glad I did it. It is a riot of color starting right about now through the middle of July, and it's just a real treat. And you can see it from the street. People stop and comment. They see all these lilies, all the different colors blooming, and it really is delightful. So I'm very, very happy with that. And I'm super happy that I decided to put a shrub by the mailbox. I think it might be a bridal wreath shrub, although I'm going to have to check. So don't hold me to that. But one of the reasons why I did that is because I put a trellis on the back of the mailbox, and I'm growing just a standard clematis behind that. And we all know that clematis like to have their feet in the shade and their heads in the sun. And so by planting that clematis so near a shrub, that's exactly what's happening. And you would just not believe how much growth that this clematis has been putting on and how vigorous the blooms are. That was another really good decision that I made up at the cabin. So very happy with those 2 little things. And then as for Maple Grove, one of the projects that I worked on this past week was replacing parts of our irrigation system. So we put in a sprinkler system when we bought this place, and then gradually, I took some of the sprinkler heads that were in a terraced garden and I converted those into drip line, except that the tubing that they used was about 1 inch in diameter. When you have great big tubing going through your garden beds, you will have great big leaks if anything happens to that line. So I was just talking to my student gardeners about this the other day. Big lines, big leaks. Little lines, little leaks. And so what I accomplished this week, which may not sound like a big deal to you, but it definitely is to me, is the fact that I replaced that huge tubing with 1/4-inch drip line. And that's going to do a couple of things for me. One, if there's a leak, it's not going to be a huge problem. It's not going to cause a water issue in the basement. It's not going to flood the property or be a problem for any of my neighbors. And then two, if you have small 1/4-inch tubing, you can move that easily. You can do those repairs easily. My student gardeners can handle repairs like that because 1/4-inch tubing, it's basically like playing with Legos. So anybody can do it. If you have been struggling with drip line on your property, if you have big tubing, I really would encourage you to consider changing that out and going to the smaller tubing. All you need to do is put a riser on your sprinkler head and then put a manifold on top of that. I have a manifold, I think that has 6 ports. Well, it's either 6 or 8. So I can have 8 different destinations coming off of that single sprinkler head. So just to give you an idea, I have one line that goes up to my kitchen garden on the deck. I have another line that goes to my elevated garden beds. And then I have 2 other lines that water garden beds that are a little further away. And then I have another line that I use just for that particular garden bed. So very versatile. I can change it at any time. I can switch things around. The tubing is lightweight, easy to work with, and definitely cheaper than that bigger inch-wide tubing that I used to have in the garden. So that was a victory. That was a major accomplishment that we did this past week. So take that under consideration if that's at all enticing to you. Okay, now before we get into the show, I have one quick announcement that I want to make. I'll tell you now, and then I'll also remind you about it at the end of the show. And that is for the rest of the summer, I am going to do episodes of the Daily Gardener podcast on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. And the reason for that is because I'm working with student gardeners in my gardens in 2 locations every single day of the week. And so that is a big commitment. It's a lot of work. And quite honestly, it tires me out. So I have to meter myself a little bit here. So I'm pulling back from the show just a little bit as we get through the summer and we get these gardens whipped into shape. And as most of you know, we need to make hay while the sun shines. So in Minnesota, we have a very compressed growing season, definitely a shorter amount of time to get into the garden and work. And of course, all my student gardeners will be going back to school after Labor Day. So I need to maximize my time with them. And then the other element that is contributing to this decision is that I am writing a book on garden history. Surprise, surprise. So for any of you who listen to the show regularly, this is not a surprise. This is definitely an area that I've already spent a great deal of time writing about and researching. And yet I have to say that when it comes to putting it all together in a book, it is a great undertaking. And so in addition to putting out the podcast, I am also working behind the scenes on this book, which I hope to finish sometime later this year. So I will definitely keep you posted on that. If any of you are authors and you have tips for me, please feel free to reach out. I would love the chance to chat with you about your writing process or any ideas or suggestions that you may have for me as I work on this project. So just to recap, there will be new episodes on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays during the summer. All right, it's time for today's curated news. Well, today's curated news comes to us from Fine Gardening. This is an article that featured Jay Sifford. He's a garden designer, and the title of the article was Jay's Garden in the Mountains. A new garden becomes a friend. Well, in case you don't know, Jay Sifford is an award-winning landscape designer in North Carolina. Shout out to my North Carolina listeners. And he was sharing his home garden in this particular article. And after I read this article, I became a little intrigued by Jay. I wanted to get to know him a little bit better. And I found a video on YouTube where he was interviewed during the pandemic about his design philosophy and his approach to working with his clients, in addition to his tips for garden design. It was a great interview. And by the way, I've just shared that in the Facebook group, so you can watch that for yourself if you'd like. But in terms of this article in Fine Gardening, what I especially appreciate is that Jay gets very specific about the plants that he uses and why he puts them where he puts them. Now, if you have a mountain home or a sloped garden, you're definitely going to want to check out this post by Fine Gardening, because that's Jay's property. He knows the challenges that are posed by slopes and mountainsides. So think about that if you're looking at your own space. Now, up at the cabin, I am not on a mountainside, but the house does have a pretty steep drop off on one particular side. And I was just staring at that this past weekend, wondering, what am I going to do here? Am I going to put in a mini orchard? Am I going to add grasses? What am I going to choose as my solution for this steep slope? Because I really don't want my son to have to continue to mow this, because every time he mows it, we have to worry about the mower tipping over or him getting hurt. So I want to try to alleviate that concern, but I'm not sure yet what I'm going to do. But Jay's garden in the mountains offers a lot of great ideas, a lot of great tips. And if you find yourself in a similar situation, one of his suggestions just may speak to you. Now, if you're interested in reading this particular article about Jay's garden, just head on over to the Facebook group for the show and search for the word Jay, Jay, and then this post will pop up and you can read about it all for yourself right there. Now, if you're not in the Facebook group, you have a standing invitation to join. All you need to do is head on up to the search bar in Facebook where you'd search for an old friend and then type in the words Daily Gardener Community and then request to join, and I'll admit you into the group happily. And before I forget to, I just want to say really quickly that if you find yourself in the Twin Cities and you'd like to pop over and say hi to me, or you want to just see my garden, my hot mess of a garden right now, or check out the botanical library that I've created, I am always delighted to have visitors. I have a listener named Diane Morissette who is stopping by later on this week, so I'm delighted to get a chance to get to know Diane better. But I just wanted to throw that out there. I am so thrilled to get a chance to talk to listeners of the show, fellow gardeners. It is always so fun to chat with you and to share our passion for gardening and garden books. Don't get me started. All right, it's time for today's botanical history. Here's botanical history for today, June 21st. Today is the birthday of the German physician, botanist, and traveler Leonhard Rauwolf, who was born on this day, June 21st in 1535, long time ago. For 2 years, between 1573 and 1575, Leonhard made a trip through the Near East. He was searching for new herbal medicines, and when he returned from his trip, he published a book with botanical descriptions for his herbarium, and then he later wrote a travel book about his adventures. And I thought you would truly enjoy hearing about what gardens were like in the town of Tripoli in Lebanon. This would have been back in the 1500s. Here's how Leonhard Rauwolf described Tripoli gardens in the 1570s. He writes, "The town of Tripoli is pretty large, full of people and of good account because of the great deposition of merchandise that's brought daily both by sea and by land. You may see an abundance of vineyards and very fine gardens enclosed with hedges for the most part. And then he goes on to list the types of plants that they were using for hedges. He mentions the little palm trees. And then check this out. He says, in these gardens, as we came in, we found all sorts of salads and kitchen herbs, such as endive, lettuce, rucola, I don't know what that is, maybe that's broccoli, asparagus, celery, tarragon, cabbages, cauliflowers, turnips, horseradishes, carrots, and then fennel, onions, and garlic. That all sounds very familiar, doesn't it? And then he also mentions the different types of fruits that were growing in these gardens. There were watermelons, different types of melons, there were gourds, and then he says sesamum, which the natives called samsim. And then he wrote, the seeds are very much used upon their bread. So I think he's talking about sesame here. He writes, in great plenty there are citrus, and then he says, at Tripoli they have no want of water, for several rivers flow down from the mountains and run partly through the town and partly through the gardens, so that they want no water, neither in the gardens nor in their houses. Tripoli, the late 1500s, would have been a great time and place to be. All right, and then today is also the birthday of the American botanist, naturalist, and author Donald Culross Peattie, who was born on this day, June 21st, in 1898. During his lifetime, Donald was regarded as the most read nature writer in America. His book, Flowering Earth, was written for the layperson, explaining concepts like chlorophyll and protoplasm and specimens like algae and seaweeds. The Hartford Times said this about Flowering Earth. Peattie makes the story of botany and its pursuit as fascinating to the reader as it is to him, and the reading of it is a delight. Well, over time, Donald Culross Peattie began to focus on trees. His most popular books on North American trees include Trees You Want to Know, that was written in 1934, The Road of a Naturalist, American Heartwood, which was written in 1949, A Natural History of Trees of Eastern and Central North America, and then finally, A Natural History of Western Trees. Now, from his book, American Heartwood, Donald wrote, wood, when you stop to think of it, has been man's best friend in the world. It was the murmuring bough above his childhood play, and the roof over the first house he called his own. It is the page he is reading at this moment. It is the forest where he seeks sanctuary from a stony world. Now, Donald Peattie's writing voice was very friendly and also quite lyrical. And here's a little excerpt, a little something that he wrote about walking. He loved to walk. He wrote, I have often started off on a walk in the state called mad, in the sense of sore-headed or mad with tedium or confusion. I've set forth dull, null, and even discouraged, but I never came back in such a frame of mind, and I never met a human being whose humor was not the better for a walk. He also wrote, all the great naturalists have been habitual walkers, for no laboratory, no book, car, train, or plane takes the place of honest footwork for this calling, be it an amateur's or a professional's. Isn't that great insight? Well, Donald had an older brother named Roderick. Now, Roderick grew up to be a geographer and an essayist. And when it came time to write about Donald, here's what Roderick once wrote. He wrote, "My young brother Donald was very skinny and quite philosophical. He took every faith but theosophy. He had a wonderful memory and a love of beauty, which still marks his life. Doubtless he was a genius, but I thought him a pest." It's time for today's Unearthed Words. Today's Unearthed Words come to us from an American author of historical and contemporary romance novels. This is Susan Wiggs, a little excerpt from her book, Summer by the Sea. She pulled up to the curb in front of number 115, a boxy house with a garden so neat that people sometimes slowed down to admire it. A pruned hedge guarded the profusion of roses that bloomed from spring to winter. Each of the roses had a name, not the proper name of its variety, but Salvatore, Roberto, Rosina, each one planted in honor of their first communion. There were also roses that honored relatives in Italy whom Rosa had never met, and a few for people she didn't know. The sturdy bush by the front step, covered in creamy white blooms, was the Celesta, of course. A few feet away was the one Rosa, a 6-year-old with a passion for Pepto-Bismol pink, had chosen for herself. Mama had been so proud of her that day, beaming down like an angel from heaven. It was one of those memories Rosa cherished, because it was so clear in her heart and mind. It's time to grow that garden library with today's book, Small Garden Design by Paul Bangay. This book came out in 2019, and I feel bad because I think some of these books that were published either right before the pandemic or during the pandemic have maybe gone overlooked. And this particular book perhaps falls into that category. But again, it's called Small Garden Design by Paul Bangay. And in this book, the Australian designer Paul Bangay, who's known for large, elegant gardens, is now sharing his top tips for designing gardens in small spaces for people who want beautiful gardens on balconies, courtyards, light wells, or rooftops. And as with the large gardens, garden design fundamentals like incorporating structure and smart plant selection play an important role. Small Garden Design focuses on tips for working with a variety of different spaces, and it's gorgeously illustrated with photos by Simon Griffiths. This book is 272 pages of small garden design loaded with practical tips on plant choices, paving, irrigation, my favorite topic lately, soil, outdoor dining, lighting, and ideas for making small spaces appear larger. You can get a copy of Small Garden Design by Paul Bangay and support the show using the Amazon link in today's show notes for around $43. Finally, here's something sweet to revive the little botanic spark in your heart. Today is the birthday of the Scottish novelist Ian McEwan, who was born on this day, June 21st, in 1948. Ian has written short stories and novels for adults, as well as a children's novel called The Daydreamer, which was illustrated beautifully by Anthony Brown. In 2012, Ian and his wife bought a stunning 9-acre dream property in the Cotswolds. One of their gardens features foxgloves and iris, lady's mantle, allium, and meadow rue. Now, you may recall that Ian's best-selling 2001 novel was Atonement, which was made into a movie starring James McAvoy and Keira Knightley back in 2007. And if you've read the book, you might remember this little passage. It goes like this. It made no sense, she knew, arranging flowers before the water was in, but there it was. She couldn't resist moving them around. And not everything people did could be in a correct, logical order, especially when they were alone. That made me chuckle because I was thinking about how often we go out into the garden to work on one project and we end up working on something else entirely. That happens to me all the time. In fact, this past week when we discovered we had a leak in the irrigation system that led to the replacement of that drip line I was telling you about earlier, well, that was not on my agenda. We were going to do completely other things that particular evening, and instead, we ended up devoting the entire night to replacing the drip line. But that's how it goes. Not always in that correct logical order. If you're going to dance with Mother Nature, you need to be ready for a change in tempo at a moment's notice. Now, before I close the show out, I just want to remind you one more time that episodes of the podcast will be coming out Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays during the summer. As always, thank you for listening to The Daily Gardener. And remember, for a happy, healthy life, garden every day. The Daily Gardener is produced in lovely Maple Grove and Wyoming, Minnesota. If you want to read today's show notes, just head on over to thedailygardener.org. And while you're there, be sure to sign up for my free Friday newsletter. And don't forget that you have a standing invitation to join the free Facebook group for listeners of the show. Just search for Daily Gardener Community the next time you're on Facebook and request to join. Last but not least, you can always get in touch by emailing me at jennifer@thedailygardener.org. I'm your host, Jennifer Ebling, and as always, have a great day in the garden, and we'll see you on Wednesday.